online markets. It's the antitrust panel you've all been waiting for. I'm Ben Brody, a senior tech policy reporter at Protocol. I'll be moderating. I want to thank IGF for bringing me back a second year. I don't think I could have asked for a better time to talk about competition in digital markets. Lawmakers, I think as you all know, are in the midst of trying to pass rules that would apply to big tech specifically. Their efforts could yield the most consequential piece of contemporary legislation yet to affect the services we use every day. Those backing the legislation are hoping to succeed in coming days, though more realistically, it would be coming weeks. First and foremost is the American Choice and Innovation Online Act, which I think this whole panel is going to be calling ICOA. It's a bipartisan platform anti-self-preferencing bill, and we'll get into what that means. But it aims to rein in practices by Google and Amazon in particular, as well as Apple. Its purpose would be to open up search or e-commerce to small players that are hoping to challenge big tech offerings even if they don't have international scale. It's originally from Congressman David Cicilline, who led the House probe into tech competition. But right now, the chief Senate architect, Amy Klobuchar, is leading the effort to pass the bill. She's fighting against a furious and expensive big tech opposition that says ICOA is a danger to privacy, content moderation, and the products that consumers love. Klobuchar and her allies want action before the unofficial kickoff of the midterm campaign season in just a couple of days. They've pledged, though, to keep up the fight through the end of the year. Depending on who you listen to, the bill will sail easily to passage if it gets floor time, or it will peter out amid concerns about its scope and unintended consequences, leaving only a strange bedfellows coalition of liberal Democrats and anti-tech arch-conservatives for the history books. We're going to talk about whether it can pass and maybe more in depth what it would actually do. But I don't want to lose track of other measures. Senators are hoping to pass a bill regulating mobile app stores, and there's been talk of bringing more competition to ad tech, and reforming how courts deal with the boring but crucial pretrial phase in antitrust lawsuits. To kick us off, how about I introduce our panel? To my immediate left, I have Will Duffield, who is a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on tech regulation and the way that platforms governance affects speech. To his left, Carl Sabo, general counsel at the tech trade group NetChoice. He's formerly an intellectual property attorney at Wildman, Herald, Allen & Dixon. He's also worked as an attorney at Venable and Arnold & Porter. And finally, last but not least, Charlotte Sleiman, competition policy director at the media think tank Public Knowledge. She previously served as the FTC antitrust division and as a legislative aide to Senator Al Franken. We'll also be taking audience questions if you guys have them. So flag me down, probably pause halfway through and then maybe at the end. But let's get to it. First question, does ICOA have the votes to pass, and how certain are you of your answer?
So I always have a rule of thumb. If you have the votes, you go to the floor and you have a vote. If you don't have the votes, then you hold a press conference saying you have the votes. And you don't have to really look that far into Shakespeare, you know, thou doth protesteth too much. But that's exactly what we're hearing time and time again out of people like Senator Amy Klobuchar, who held yet another press conference the other night. You might have missed it because you probably went to bed. If you're me, it was around 9 p.m. She starts by opening and saying, this is attempting to appeal to all you watching C-SPAN at 9 p.m. on a Monday night, and that was her. Yes, many of my reporter friends eventually said, you know what, I'm packing it in, I'm going to bed, there's nothing new here. The thing about this legislation that we're talking about is not only does it not have the votes, it's not had a single hearing either. And we're talking about one of the most influential, destructive pieces of legislation that will impact almost every single American in negative ways. We've seen study after study showing how it will increase inflation. We've seen cybersecurity experts from both sides of the aisle, whether it is Clapper or whether it is cybersecurity experts on the right, like, I'm blanking on his name right now. So we've got a bunch of outstanding questions. Will this bill actually make it harder to keep Americans' privacy secure? We know it will increase inflation. We know it will harm our ability to get stuff delivered as though it weren't hard enough already. We know she doesn't have the votes, and we know that every single legislator who learns more about this bill realizes it's less appealing. So Ben, long answer to a short question. Does she have the votes? Of course not, because if she did, it would be law.
Charlotte, does she have the votes?
Absolutely. Senator Klobuchar has been very clear. Senator Grassley has been very clear. There are more than 60 votes for this bill. It still needs to come to the floor. We absolutely are still working on getting it to the floor. I think convincing everyone that there really are the votes is the next step in the process, but the votes are there. And when a vote is scheduled, that's when, there was this Washington Post story that some may have seen where many people were not willing to tell a Washington Post reporter how they're planning to vote before the vote is scheduled. I think that's normal. I think that's common. I think that's to be expected. I don't see that as a source of concern. I really want to respond to this idea that there haven't been hearings because I think it's laughable. There have been so many hearings. There have been 10 hearings on the Senate side, many hearings on the House side. On the House side, there was an in-depth report over the course of 16 months. They interviewed the CEOs of the companies, brought the CEOs of the companies to testify. I think folks probably remember that hearing. But they had many interviews with executives. They had thousands of documents that they reviewed. It was an incredibly well-researched report over the course of over a year that folks can read. It was just finally published in its final version this past week. So I highly recommend it. It's a great source of information if you're trying to learn more about why these bills are so important. Congress has absolutely done its work here, done its homework, and the bill is ready to go.
So I think I agree perhaps on the normative question more with Carl. I do think most of those hearings over the past year and reports and all have been sort of on the state of antitrust rather than the specifics and effects of either of these bills. But looking at how the previously seemingly ironclad bipartisan consensus in favor of this bill has broken down is interesting and tells us a lot about the state of tech regulation and likelihood of other things passing too. Because the more this became about content and questions about how ICOA would affect or limit platforms' ability to police content, the more that bipartisan consensus broke down. In Washington, there's a real tension between the left and right about what they want out of any legislation as far as how it affects speech. And when that comes to the fore, it seems like any consensus that previously existed starts to evaporate.
Will, I want you to pick up on that. You said that the hearings were maybe more broadly on the state of competition in big tech. What is the state of competition in big tech? And I would love to address some of the allegations that were in that report that we've seen over many months, but we did see some more documentation that came out of it just in the last week, suggesting that Facebook doesn't see itself as having really any rivals. Google has basically signed agreements that it tried to make it exclusive. These sorts of things. What is the state of competition in big tech right now?
So I think it all turns, obviously, on market definition, but that there is much more competition going on and many more options for consumers than a lot of critics of the legal status quo give credit. When we think about things like search markets, we tend to, or this antitrust conversation, treats search and general search as essentially identical. In fact, many searches begin in more specific places than your generalized Google search. You can begin a shopping search on Amazon, search for images on DeviantArt, that sort of thing. And that happens all the time, but is lost in our conversation about search. I think we can see the same thing across lots of other markets. And new markets are emerging, more so than any of the regulation proposed this year. I think the growth of both the VR and AI markets has been the most exciting shift in the competition space and big tech for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that not only wasn't considered as many of the investigations, quote unquote, went on. So Facebook, when these bills were written, their valuation was over $500 billion. now is less than $500 billion. That is due in part to several factors: competition, the Biden economy, many other things. And what we're seeing is the #1 website visited last year is TikTok. Not originally conceived in the antitrust bill. So suddenly the authors are like, wait a minute, you're telling me the markets change? You're telling me that somebody else can come out of nowhere and have success? Well, we need to rewrite the bill because we want to target these businesses. Now, one of the things that we used to face back when we were in England was the king would basically say, you, Carl Szabo, are illegal. Not what you are doing is illegal. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of the legislation that's being proposed. That's what we're seeing with the phrase, quote unquote, big tech. If you go around the country like I do and talk to Republicans across the nation, they will use the term big tech. They will say Twitter is big tech. Twitter's valuation is, well, as you know, because of the Elon Musk Twitter discussion, it's somewhere around $23 billion. That's Twitter's valuation. It's somewhere around like a mid-size. Yelp's not too reasonable corollary. So the problem with the word alone, big tech, means different things to different people depending on who you talk to. If you talk to the authors of ICOA, or as I like to call it, S2992, it's Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, maybe Microsoft, we're not sure. We want to capture TikTok, so let's write a special provision to just go after them. Anybody else we don't like, the Yelp doesn't like, let me see, you guys, okay, we'll add you in. You go and talk to conservatives about big tech, it's Twitter. And once again, Twitter's not what Democrats consider to be big tech. So the problem is, first, what do we call big tech has not been yet established. Second, and this gets to the point that was just brought up, is Amazon considered, quote unquote, big tech? What's Amazon's main known for? It's known for buying and selling goods. Do you know what the largest retailer on the planet is? I'll give you a hint. It ain't Amazon. It's Walmart. Walmart has double the revenue of Amazon. So Amazon, that we all use for much of our shopping, is what we may use, but it's not what most Americans use. It's not what most of the world uses. That's going to be Walmart because they're double the size. So what are we actually talking about? If we narrow the scope of the market so darn small that all we talk about is this company, if I define the market to be Amazon, if I define the market to be Facebook, if I define the market to be Google, then yes, I can successfully show you have 100% dominance in that market. I can look around this room and say 100% of the people here are alive. They may not be after they finish listening to me, but they are all alive. Living people have a dominance in this marketplace of this room over the dead people. Well, yeah, of course. I'm defining the markets in an absolutely insane way. And that's what we're seeing on Capitol Hill. In an effort to identify things that they don't like, to achieve remedies that the law and basically our notions of free markets and freedom won't allow, they're trying to create laws to specifically target individual actors and criminalize not the behavior but the people themselves. The last point that I do want to raise is, as we're looking at these markets, I think the other thing is, we'll just pick on the example of search. If you leave tonight and you're not satisfied with the lunch that you had and you want to go out and get a dinner, one of the things that I often do is I go to OpenTable, figure out who's going to be able to have seating for me right here, right now, for an American food, ideally a hamburger. That's a search, because it's going to search all the people on OpenTable and tell me who's available. Well, maybe afterwards I want to go find a place to run around, a park. I'll go to Yelp. There are multiple different types of searches we do all the time, and they're customized specific searches and not just general searches. So that's what we're seeing constantly, time and time again, is a handful of lawmakers are either running for higher position. Amy Klobuchar is running for president. She's trying to sell her books. Lena Khan wrote a paper. She's trying to prove she's right. She's the chair of the FTC. And they're trying to write legislation to justify their misguided fundamental basis for their supposition. And that's just something we can't allow.
I'm not trying to sell Amy Klobuchar's books, but I think it would be really helpful for you to read a book about antitrust law, such as hers, because I think the way that you're describing it is completely incoherent. So I do want to address one thing that you said about the changes to the bill. Yes, the bill has changed. There have been many changes to accommodate people's concerns. That is the project of legislating. That is how we pass legislation. We hear people's concerns and changes to accommodate those concerns. So yes, there have been changes. I think that's a good thing. That has brought people on board. I think that's what serious legislation needs to do. So that's why there have been changes. It is very clear who is covered by the bill. You described it. No one is saying that Twitter is covered by the bill. I think some of Microsoft's products are covered by the bill and some are not. Twitter is obviously not covered by the bill. None of the advocates of the bill are saying that Twitter is covered by the bill. So I think it's very clear, and it would be really helpful to have this in law so that we know which are the companies to which we have these requirements applying. This is a limitation of existing antitrust law today that makes it more difficult to bring antitrust cases and makes it more expensive. The government has to expend more resources. I know that's not something that you want to enforce the antitrust laws, because companies can often argue, I'm not a monopoly, you should not be applying these rules to me. Congress has done the investigation, Congress has done the work. They're clearly specifying now what are the characteristics of companies that will have these rules apply to them. With that gatekeeper power come these gatekeeper responsibilities so that we can have fair competition. I think it's really important to talk about what is at stake here. Entrepreneurs come to us and they say, we don't have an opportunity. We are looking at trying to offer consumer products and we can't get through. We don't have an open marketplace to reach our potential customers. These gatekeepers are making the decisions based on what will benefit them and not what will benefit consumers, what will benefit innovation. That's what we want, that's what we need, and so we need to open up these markets for competition with the American Innovation and Choice Online Act.
Would anybody be happy with a bill that includes Twitter, Walmart, and Microsoft very clearly?
So the thing with our approach
TikTok too.
Yeah, our approach to antitrust law is not about who, it's about what. And that's the way that all of our laws are written. We don't criminalize people, we criminalize actions. Once again, going back to my example. We don't say Carl is illegal, we say Carl stabbing somebody is illegal. Stabbing is illegal, not the person doing it. The action, that's what we criminalize. The King of England criminalizes people. That's one of the reasons why we broke away. It's one of the reasons why we have the Bill of Rights and such other legal protections to prevent the state from declaring you person illegal, you person unlawful. And Ben, your question is, should we write a law to criminalize people? No. Should we write a law to criminalize companies that somebody in the legislature doesn't like? Of course not. Why? Because we know how easily that is abused. For those of you who
well, wait, Carl, I want to turn that back on you. Your criticism was that these aren't included, that Walmart is the biggest retailer, that TikTok is the most visited website. So why not add them in?
No, I was not arguing that I'm upset because they're not included in 2992. The point that I was raising is that they aren't included because this is not about regulating conduct. This is about regulating people. This is not about criminalizing bad actions. This is about essentially breaking up groups that we don't like or who essentially haven't supported our campaigns enough. We saw this under the last administration. We saw how a White House could lean on a Federal Trade Commission, a Department of Justice, to try and pressure businesses into keeping up or removing speech that they do or do not want. We saw it with the Washington Post, for example, under the last administration. What we are seeing here is a similar effort to lean on businesses to do what they want or to not do what they want. What we need to do is return to the fundamentals of our values, which is equal protection and opportunity. Now, the good news is, if there is a business out there that does have market power, abuses that market power, and results in consumer harm, we don't need any new laws. We can take an enforcement action today under existing antitrust law. And in fact, many state AGs have brought such suits that are underway. Now, there are two provisions. Either one, those suits are legally invalid if we go forth with the arguments made by my colleague over here, or two, that they are legally valid and just we want to make it easier to prosecute a handful of businesses we don't like. And that's what's being missed. This legislation is not about protecting consumers. Our antitrust law for the past 50 years, supported by every Supreme Court justice, whether it's Antonin Scalia, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you name it, has been about protecting consumers first. It looks at our consumers being harmed. If you go back and read one of the preeminent authors of the HJC report, Lena Khan, her first law review paper is centered around the proposition that Amazon prices are too low. Now, we do have a law against that. It's called predatory pricing, where you list a price well below marginal cost so that you can drive competitors out of the market. And her argument was, Amazon's prices are so low that competitors can't compete. Well, if you're a consumer, I love low prices. And apparently no competitors have really dropped out of the market since Walmart still remains the largest retailer in the world. Her argument is, well, they're just playing a 40-year long game. That's what it is. It's a really long rope-a-dope being done. But that's what the consumer welfare standard is. And that's what we're seeing a attack against. Because instead of worrying about, is the consumer paying less? Is the consumer getting better innovation? Are they getting better products? We are instead trying to return to an area where it's, you know what, I don't like you, business. So rather than creating a fair law, a level playing field, a single set of rules that everybody can comply with, we're just going to criminalize a handful of businesses that we don't like. And that's where I get incensed. That's where I get frustrated. And to answer your question, Ben, if they were included, I would still hate the bill because we need to outlaw bad actions. We don't criminalize people.
Charlotte, maybe if you could take that first, although I want you to speak to Amazon maybe. You know, why not think of Walmart, Twitter, TikTok increasingly as gatekeepers?
So the bill does not call out particular companies, of course. It sets forth neutral criteria at the request of many people. You know, analysts are trying to explain how it's likely to be interpreted, and so we have identified these are probably the companies that will be covered, but the criteria include having a $550 billion market cap, being an online platform. There are criteria listed in the bill, so it's not you know, listing particular companies. I do think that these are the companies that we're particularly concerned about, and so I am glad that they are covered by the bill. But if other companies become much larger and more powerful, I think they may be covered in the future, and that's right, that's good. I'm hopeful that if this bill is successful to create more competition, that we might see different companies becoming powerful, and that would be excellent. I do want to talk a little bit about why we think today's antitrust law is insufficient for this problem. There are antitrust cases today against some of the largest platforms. I was very excited to see those cases get filed. I think they're very strong cases. But I have been saying since before they were filed and right after they were filed that we're still going to need legislation because there is a very large problem here that we're trying to deal with. So the antitrust cases are focused on particular conduct by these particular companies. There's some against Google, there's some against Facebook. We haven't yet seen a federal case against Amazon or Apple. The problem is broad. So first, antitrust cases are going to remedy the particular conduct that they're focused on. They take a long time. These cases were filed actually in the Trump administration. The Biden administration has been keeping them up valiantly, but it's going to continue for years just before they even get to their trial date. And then I'm sure that there will be appeal after appeal, so it takes a long time. Part of the big benefit of ACO is giving that notice in advance, putting companies on notice so that they will begin to follow the law before we have to bring these enforcement actions. I think there will be a lot of changes that the companies make right away before the government even has to do enforcement, although I'm sure there will be tricky cases and the government will bring cases. The structure of these platform markets gives them this gatekeeper power. They are, Elizabeth Warren talks about how they control the playing field, but they're also an umpire. They're also the teams playing. They're so vertically integrated that they are in control of choosing winners and losers against themselves. They have the ability to prevent a potential competitor from having success and having a real shot to compete against them. So that's bigger than what we're able to accomplish with these antitrust law cases. We need something more.
Will, I want to bring you in on this. If you could talk about maybe the sufficiency of antitrust law as currently interpreted, and particularly as it touches on contemporary markets. But maybe if you wanted to talk as well about this notion of a gatekeeper and whether we need that.
Yeah, so I think as we're thinking about these various antitrust proposals and what they might or will do, we need to think about the goal of competition policy and what tends to or has traditionally happened when we see companies competing over a long period of time to offer new products in the tech space. Traditionally, firms have built fairly substantial moats, for lack of a better word, around the products they've created. Consumer choice is very sticky, network effects aside, and it can be hard to move them from what they're used to doing, the product they enjoy and are familiar with, to something different. However, as time goes on, new markets emerge that no one really realized existed, and so the previous moat, while it's never filled in, doesn't matter in the way that it once did. Microsoft's dominance in on-device word processing has never really been challenged. I mean, I guess some people use LaTeX, but ooh. However, plenty of people use Google Docs. There's this cloud-based word processing that back in 1998, no one thought of as a thing or a potential market. And we see that all over the place. So if we're worried about this dynamic perhaps not moving along quickly enough, we would hope for antitrust to fill in these moats and allow competition in these existing markets. And none of these proposals really seem to even aspire to do that. We tinker around the edges with app stores and sort of the presentation of first-party versus third-party data within search, but no one is thinking about displacing the iPhone or that any of these bills would, displace the iPhone, create new competition in the markets for phones. Instead, that will happen. The iPhone will be displaced by something else down the road, maybe a VR headset, something, who knows, AR goggles. And we don't know what that will look like today, but it doesn't seem like any of these proposals are likely to either get us there more quickly, especially when you start limiting firms' ability to throw money into these new markets. Will Facebook win in VR? I'm skeptical, frankly, looking at how much more fun VR chat is to use, but they've certainly created a new app ecosystem by throwing money into hardware development and creating an app store that previously didn't exist and no one else was really building early on. So, at best, I think the ultimate result of a lot of these bills would be to slow the creation of these new markets while not doing much to fill in existing moats.
I doubt I'm going to get you guys to all agree, so I think we should maybe move on and deal with some of the specific consequences of the bill. I want to talk about Amazon Prime, so I'm sure you guys will now agree, and we can all just move on. This won't be contentious at all. So obviously, there's been a lot of criticism that the bill would destroy a lot of services that consumers love. Amazon Prime maybe being sort of the most easy to grasp and most popular because it does, there's so many subscribers and so many people who save money with it. Just last month, Amazon said basically that ICOA would force it to allow other logistics providers to fulfill Prime orders, which I think kind of struck a lot of people because there had been much more grandiose claims about how ICOA would destroy Prime, and other logistics providers had long fulfilled Prime orders. Should we really worry about some of these claims about what ICOA would do to popular free services?
So at the beginning of the pandemic, Amazon was really having trouble fulfilling orders. I think that was for a variety of reasons. But the result was that other fulfillment services were faster. But they were not winning the buy box because Amazon put a thumb on the scale for their own company, Fulfilled by Amazon, and the retailers that were using them. Other fulfillment services were faster, and Amazon refused to put them in the top billing place. A lot of people actually, maybe I should explain this, a lot of people don't know what the buy box is. When you do a search on Amazon and you choose what product you're going to buy, and then there's a little place that says buy now, Amazon is actually running an algorithm to decide which of the many, many retailers you could actually choose from to put in that buy box. And all of these other competitors are hidden behind this very fine print that says other sellers. So that's what the buy box is. When we talk about winning the buy box, you literally don't even see the people who aren't in the buy box. So that's huge. So this is saying that Amazon would have to open that up for competition. I think that could lead to better fulfillment services. That could lead to faster, cheaper, or, you know, I might prefer a fulfillment service that is slower, but is not sending their workers to the hospital so much that they need to keep an ambulance parked outside the warehouse. There's a lot of different things that consumers might want from their fulfillment services, and there ought to be competition.
So last night, my wife wasn't feeling well, and she asked me to go pick up groceries, so I drove over to the Safeway. And as I'm walking in the store, the first thing I see are a bunch of bags of chips, and they are branded 365 brand. That's Safeway's own proprietary brand. When I go to Costco, I see the Kirkland brand when you first walk in. That's self-preferencing. When I walked into CVS earlier today, I saw CVS brands prominently displayed above generic name brands. We call the off brands, the Kirkland brands, the 365 brands, we call them generics. They provide a lower cost option for consumers. And if a business wants to feature its own products ahead of its competitors, that is the right of that business. Now let's
Unless they're a monopoly.
Right, and I think we established that they're not the majority retail seller in the world. And if they are a monopoly and they have market power and they abuse that market power and it results in consumer harm, then yes, you can bring an enforcement action against them today. So let's roll back the clock a couple of years. Many of us don't remember the beginning of Amazon. It used to only be a bookseller. And they would only sell items that they went and bought, so they became what is called the seller of record. That is where they had the personal ownership, and guess what? It sat on their books. If they didn't sell it, then they were liable for those losses. Eventually, they decided, you know, we're going to open this up to third-party sellers. People can create their own storefronts and essentially start to do direct-to-consumer advertising and sales through our platform. That way, the seller gets the brand recognition of Amazon, they get the trust of the Amazon payment processing, and they get to do direct-to-consumer selling, and Amazon doesn't have to take the liability of being what is called the seller of record on their books. Then they began offering something called Amazon Prime. And the way Amazon Prime works is they guarantee it's going to be there in 2 days. Now, they did an experiment a couple years ago, and they said, you know what? We're going to do a very small experiment with a handful of sellers who claim that they are able to guarantee 2-day delivery. They are able to reach the Amazon Prime standard that we all have come to expect every time we hit that click button. 2 days or less, it's going to be there. So Amazon did this trial in a part of the US. Some of the sellers, they were able to get it there. Some of them couldn't. Some of them got it there some of the time. But the thing is, I as a customer, I want my stuff in 2 days. If it says Prime, it better be there in 2 days or somebody's getting an angry phone call. That's what Amazon saw. They saw a lot of sellers raise their hand. Yes, I can do it. I promise. I swear to goodness I can do it. And some of them could for a time. Some of them could all the time. Some of them couldn't even do it half the time. And they realized, you know what? The Prime brand, that is our brand. And anyone who's ever actually had a brand, had a trademark, represented anybody, you know the importance and the value of that brand. It is everything. Because if people don't believe when I click, it'll be there in 2 days on Amazon Prime, I'll just go over to Target. I'll go over to Walmart. I'll go over to somebody else who can not only promise me 2-day delivery, but can guarantee it. Now, what this bill is calling for is to say, you know what? If Carl Szabo wants to create Carl Szabo delivery service, then and say, you know what, I can get there to you, Ben, in 2 days. Well, then Amazon has to give me the same top billing as their guaranteed brand recognized 2-day delivery. In fact, they have to give me a Prime badge if I wanted it. And what that means is that Prime value, that Prime badge is worthless. Because I can guarantee you something will happen in my life where that package ain't going to get to you in 2 days. But this bill would require me to list it as Carl's delivery service, Prime guaranteed 2-day delivery. And that's what's going on. Now, real quickly before we go. Amazon actually in England just came to a settlement with the government over there where they will allow third-party delivery systems. But they actually do the opposite of what 2992 does. 2992 says, I don't care how good you are, you automatically get the Prime badge. You can get there in 2 months, whatever. It doesn't matter, you get Prime. What they did in England is they said, Amazon can set a standard. If people can match that standard, then they can get the Prime badge. So rather than just handing out Prime badges to everybody who puts up their hand, we're asking people to actually bring it up, step up their game, and if you can bring your A game, if you can bring the same level of service and expectation that Amazon customers deserve and pay for, then you can get that Prime badge, which is the opposite of what we're seeing in 2992, which is just, you know what, we don't want anyone to try that hard, and the consumer, they can get their package eventually. Janikowski said, you can just go drink your wine while you wait for your Peloton bike, but that's not what we as consumers want. We want what we pay for, and that's the 2-day delivery that is guaranteed to us today that will be lost under 2992. And frankly, if we're worried about protecting consumers, it's hard enough for me to get my stuff now because of supply chains. I loathe to think about what it would be like under 2992.
I want to bring Will into this. And Will, I'd like you to address a conflation that I think Carl made a little bit between third-party sellers and third-party logistics. Now, it's possible I could act as a third-party seller, as my own logistics provider. I could hop on my bike. But generally speaking, the third-party logistics that we're talking about, that's UPS, USPS, and FedEx.
Well, so I think we're getting right into the minutia of Amazon's sort of content policy and internal governance, but all of this is being discussed under the rubric of self-preferencing. And neither side seems to really have a clear sense of what behaviors, activities, product presentation, bundling, et cetera, would be prohibited as self-preferencing. I think not only does it make it really hard to have any kind of conversation about what the actual effects of the bill will be, it shows that it's just too broad a way of going at all of the niche concerns that people have about how these services are run. You know, one issue with Amazon that's been brought up in its treatment of third-party sellers is its demand for most favored nation status. You can't sell products elsewhere for cheaper than you do on Amazon. Is that rule self-preferencing in some sense relative to, Amazon's store brand? I don't know, but I think a narrower bill or set of bills, legislation that would prohibit specific acts like that if we have an issue with it, rather than just sort of throwing this new definition of self-preferencing up and leaving it for years down the line, the FTC to define it via enforcement action. It's just really vague and makes it hard for anyone to do business on either side of this.
So I'm really excited to respond to this because I've heard this before, and I think it's really important. The bill should not be more specific. I do not want the bill to say exactly what needs to happen with fulfilled by Amazon and what degree of, at which level and all of these details that we're discussing, because that would be outdated in a month or two. I don't think you guys want that either. It's really important to be clear about the role of Congress and the role of agencies. And the role of Congress is to set the values. This bill is actually a lot more specific than the Sherman Act, for example. There needs to be interpretation by courts. There needs to be enforcement by agencies. I actually think that agency rulemaking is a really important part of this process. These bills do not, create authority for agency rulemaking. That's something that I, wished from the beginning was a part of it. There will be guidelines. I think that that will provide a lot of predictability for businesses and other stakeholders. I think the guidelines are where we can get more specific. But I really don't think that Congress should set as a goal writing out their legislation as specific as you're saying. One, they do not yet have that level of expertise that agency experts have or that you develop throughout the process of a court case. And I don't think that they should endeavor to develop that level of detail. There are a lot of issues that I want Congress to be dealing with. If they spend time or hire staff to develop that level of detailed knowledge for every issue, it's really not going to work. So we have in our system of government, agencies, courts, they are supposed to interpret the laws, and I don't want the law to say exactly how Fulfilled by Amazon ought to be set up. That's not the goal.
Well, then you're going beyond interpretation and into lawmaking when you have a body that does determine how the Amazon program should be set up under the new law. Yes, congressional lack of expertise is a real issue. This is something to be solved by increasing tech expertise in Congress, not handing their lawmaking function off to the executive branch.
But that can only go so far. I mean, certainly a line needs to be drawn somewhere, and it may be that we disagree about where that line ought to be drawn, but I think the bill is very specific. In addition to the 3 sort of broad clauses at the top, there are 7 very specific prohibitions. I really don't think that it should get more specific than that.
Then why don't we know who is covered and how their products will be affected by it? I mean, advocates, the people who drafted the bill, can't even explain it.
I think we do know who is covered, and I think we have a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like. But when we get down to those level of specificity that Carl was describing, we don't, and I think that's okay.
So just to
I'm
point
giving you
out,
30 seconds, Carl.
cool. I think everyone should go and check out one of the most influential decisions out of the U.S. Supreme Court this past session. That was the decision in the EPA case, where the U.S. Supreme Court basically said kind of exactly what you're saying, what our founders wanted. When it comes to writing laws, apparently the legislative branch is supposed to do that. When it comes to enforcing laws, that's the executive branch, and judging laws, judicial branch. Not some hodgepodge because Congress doesn't have enough experts. Now, if there is confusion, if there are more facts, if there is more information that needs to be gleaned, wow, what a great opportunity to actually have a hearing on this bill. What a great opportunity to bring in more experts to actually have a discussion on this. I mean, that's exactly what we're looking at right now is the argument, well, we can't possibly think about this anymore. We need to rush this through and hand it over to the executive branch. Why?
I was present in person at the hearing about self-preferencing that Senator Klobuchar held.
I have one that you guys are going to agree on much more. I'm certain I've come to it. Will, I actually want you to start. The bill restricts discrimination, and I'm quoting here, in the application of enforcement of terms of service among similarly situated business users. It's the content moderation question, guys. 4 Democratic senators have gone on record saying this would imperil current content moderation practices by putting competition policy in direct conflict with the ability of companies to take down hate speech, disinformation, and misinformation, and other objectionable content under existing law. Senator Klobuchar has openly refused to do anything about this, and Republicans have been pretty open that this is the point of the language. They want to preserve the Parlers, the Gaps, the Truth Socials. How should we be thinking through this provision and how it might ultimately operate in court for, say, an ambitious Republican state attorney general?
So, Ben, I have to dispute part of your question. I think the Republicans...
Mostly quotes.
What?
It's mostly quotes.
The Republicans have not said that they intend for the language to be used that way. That was not a quote.
They have. In prior, Senator Ted Cruz is very open about how he believes that this...
At the markup, Ted Cruz brought this up. His amendment was rejected. I think that's pretty clear that that interpretation is not accepted by anyone else. What I have heard Ken Buck and Chuck Grassley talk about is the benefits that competition will have for content moderation. That is not the same as saying that 3A3 prevents platforms from doing content moderation. 3A3 is a clause of the bill. It does not prevent platforms from doing content moderation. That's not correct, and I haven't heard anyone other than Ted Cruz say that.
I think it depends on what the moderation action is. I mean, there are clearly moderation actions that app stores could or have taken in the past, which would be prohibited by this. You look at Parler being kicked off. They're clearly a competitor to certain Google services, and were kicked off of a Google app store. It's fairly easy to present that as anti-competitive moderation. There's another provision that I was just trying to pull up now, bundled alongside that, prohibiting discriminatory or sort of idiosyncratic moderation. And that, on its face right now, is a standard which I think most companies can't meet, period. Like Amazon or Apple's treatment of different apps. If you have grounds to sue because some app received a different determination yet carried similar content, well, I mean, frankly, these decisions are all over the place now. It depends a little bit on which staffer, on how well-known the app is, and so trying to bring some, or expecting some uniformity of that among these covered platforms just seems ridiculous to me.
So I want to be clear that the Parler situation that you're talking about, that case was brought under current law. I think part of the concern here is that the legislation, although it is very clear that this needs to, that the conduct needs to be anti-competitive, right? It needs to have a material harm on competition. I think that's very clear. The concerns that we hear, since there is no private right of action, so we're not going to be seeing a company like Parler being able to bring a case under this legislation. The concern that we hear is that the law might be misused by someone, and that maybe a disingenuous judge would take seriously a case that is not really valid under the law, but maybe it could get to a motion to dismiss, something like that. I really think that this is very unrealistic, and I think the fact that we have these problems already today under current law shows that having a new law that is going to provide competition and has these great benefits that we have talked about, I hope we'll have more time to talk about, is incredibly valuable, and that if that's already happening, it's not going to become worse. What I really want to talk about, though, is the reason that platforms are doing content moderation today. I think they are receiving a lot of pressure, both from their users and from advertisers, to do a better job of content moderation. Those incentives will actually be increased if there is competition. If people can actually choose an alternative, I think that the companies will feel more pressure to do a better job of getting those content moderation decisions right. So I think we actually have an opportunity to improve things here.
Ben, I've got some good news for you. I think you'll be able to keep your job, because I think your stats and figures are correct. Senator Grassley, so there was actually a press conference, one of the many press conferences. This was the, I swear, I've got the votes this time, press conference by Senator Klobuchar, and Senator Grassley was there. Senator Grassley stood up. He said, "This will eliminate big tech's ability to censor conservatives," or something to that effect. We've got a video of it over at netchoice.org. You don't have to watch the whole press conference, just a couple clips. And then almost immediately thereafter, David Cicilline, the sponsor on the House side, Senator Klobuchar, senator on sponsor on the Senate side, stand up and say, "No one takes seriously the notion that this would eliminate content moderation." And what you're seeing is the very fundamental problem with this bill. Nobody knows what it does, not even its authors. You are seeing the Republican co-sponsors or chief sponsor, whether it's somebody, Ted Cruz, who's considering signing on, or it's the co-sponsor, Senator Chuck Grassley, saying this will allow us to finally eliminate big tech censorship on content moderation, or the Democratic sponsors. This will in no way impact big tech censorship of conservatives, and we can keep our pedal to the metal on it. In fact, 4 Democratic senators actually sent a letter to the sponsor, Senator Klobuchar, with proposed language to clarify this, because I mean, right here, we're seeing a disagreement. We're seeing a disagreement amongst the sponsors themselves. 4 senators, Lujan, Wyden, and 2 others who I can't pull off the top of my head, sent a letter with ledge language to clarify that this will not impact content moderation. The response they got was, oh, don't worry, it's unnecessary. Now, one of the things I learned very early on in my years at NetChoice, just saying something's unnecessary is not dispositive of doing it, right? It's unnecessary. Well, Senator Klobuchar, if it's unnecessary to add this language and it will guarantee you 4 Democratic votes, why not do it? Why not do it? Oh, is it because it will fundamentally change the language? Will it maybe convince the Republicans that this bill doesn't do what they think it does? If that's the situation, then just say it. Just take the language, because saying it's unnecessary or redundant means that you have no reason not to accept it. And that's kind of where we are with this bill. It is an absolute mess. Nobody seems to know what it does. And let's rush it through? No, of course not. Let's actually have a hearing on the bill, because you know what Congress is supposed to do? They're supposed to be thoughtful. They're supposed to be deleterious and intelligent and take your time and actually produce products that when I say something, it's clear. Because one of the purposes, as was explained earlier, of this legislation is to create clear rules of the road when it comes to antitrust. As we've heard from this panel, it does anything but.
Will, I'm going to give you the last word on this, and then I want to get through a few more before we get some audience questions.
Oh, I guess I would just add that, regardless of what the bill's supporters on the left or Klobuchar as its current author would like or think that the bill will do, the Republican votes that they need to pass it are premised upon it cutting back on App Store moderation.
I just really don't think that's right. And I do want to address this political point. I think it's correct that Democrats and Republicans disagree about what needs to happen in content moderation. The reason that this bill has a shot is because it is not about content moderation. It is about antitrust. And I think in antitrust, there is a lot more room for agreement. People agree that we want open, competitive markets. We agree that, giving private actors a fair shot to compete is going to improve things, and that the power of a few companies is something that we need to address. That's something that can get agreement. I think it's important that the bill does focus on competition. It is not about content moderation. My concern about an amendment that says, something content moderation, how are we going to define content moderation? I think bringing the words content moderation into the bill creates a whole new fight about content moderation, when I'd really prefer for the Energy and Commerce Committee to be dealing with content moderation. I think content moderation is a separate question that's very important for us to work on, but this is about antitrust.
Now vague definitions won't do?
What?
Now vague definitions won't do?
Oh, no, so you could choose not to define it, right, and let the courts decide. But with the words content moderation, that makes me extremely nervous.
Are we going to be having, we have one from Barron. Do we have any, we're going to have? I want to get through at least 1 or 2 other things before we get to these audience questions. So let's say that ICOA passes tomorrow and is signed by the president, I suppose, in the residence. We all wish him well, I'm sure. Next week, House passes it as well. I want you to talk to me about what you think the tech world will look like in 5 years, and if you could be somewhat high level and quick so that we have time for these audience questions, that would be great. Well, why don't you take it off?
Okay, let's see. I guess long term, I'm most, with all of these antitrust bills, worried about the effect on acquisitions and capital available for startups. Obviously, the interest rate environment we're in now, or going into, is not nearly as friendly to startup development as what we've had over the past decade. And the expectation of potential acquisition drives a tremendous amount of funding to startups. If you take that away, especially in a high-rate environment, then the sorts of new firms which drove fundamental technical advances, which were later adopted by others, either through acquisition or merely the sort of proliferation of the new way of doing things, I worry those firms may not exist and will miss a lot of things that we don't realize we're missing 5 years from now.
So we actually saw a one-pager. It's from this company called Radio Shack. You probably don't remember them. It went out of business a couple years ago. And it was an ad for a bunch of different products, and they were all really, really expensive. You had a recording device. You had what's called a camcorder. That's a video recorder. You had a TV. You had a radio. You had a phone. You had cell phones didn't even exist at the time of this ad, or as one of the Zach Morris-sized cell phones. Guess what? I got them all in my pocket. There's a flashlight in here too. That's called integration. That is the type of adoption and innovation of technology that we want to see. Now, one of the examples that often comes up is, oh, well, it's really unfair when a business self-preferences or creates something that dislocates another competitor. And I like to use the example of the flashlight app. I don't know if you remember, a long time ago, the iPhone didn't have a flashlight app natively. It had a camera with a flash on it, but you couldn't activate it if you needed a flashlight. Now, most of us don't even have flashlights. We just have our phones. Well, one day somebody wakes up and they say, you know what? I figured out a way to hack into the camera protocol and activate the flashlight, so I will charge $5 for it. Somebody's like, you know what? I can make an app that does it for $4 and 3 and 2 and 1. Eventually gets down to 0 with ads. And then Apple says, you know what? This is such a silly feature. Let's just make it native to the phone. Is the consumer harmed by this? No. We get a free flashlight app that is native to our phone without having to download any apps. Under $29.92 ICOA or anything like that, they would say, you know what, you can't do that, Apple. That's self-preferencing. Boo, shame on you. You should have to pay $5 for that flashlight app. That's what we're talking about today. And that's the type of innovation that will be precluded with this legislation. And as you point out, there's an article today about how startup investment is at an all-time low. And that is due in part to the economic state, but it is also due in part to a war on mergers and acquisitions and a war on innovation that we are seeing, and that trickles down economically to somebody who is an investor, who is looking to invest in a business. And guess what? Investors want to make money. That's their number one goal. And one of the reasons they do that is because they expect an acquisition or a return on investment. Now, some of them go off. Discord shirked off acquisition and it's doing okay. Facebook shirked off acquisition is doing okay. Others don't feel like they can continue that growth curve and need to get acquired. We need to make that possible, otherwise people won't invest. And that's the problem that's being missed, is a lot of this legislation is being driven by people who just don't fundamentally understand economics, who've not taken a couple minutes to take a step back and look at what is the macro effects of these actions that I'm taking. And that's kind of why I get so frustrated, because yes, I play a lawyer on TV, but my background is in economics and business. And when I see legislation like this, I see the trickle-down impact on the next startup getting invested, and this is going to forestall that. So as much as we want competition, the best way to do that is to actually get the government out of the regulation business, lower regulations, make it easier for startups to enter the market, and increase the ability to invest in them, not this kind of top-down handful of companies we don't like attack policy that we're seeing in this legislation. Charlotte?
Yes, Ben, I love this question. I'm so excited by this idea. If the bill passes in 5 years, I am so excited to see the innovations that will come from new companies that will have an opportunity to fairly compete. I'm excited to see what the venture capital firms are interested to invest in now that they know that Google and Facebook are not going to control which business is allowed to move forward. I think about Bell Labs, which depending on, if you've read Tim Wu's book or how much you've studied this, you might think Bell Labs was an engine of innovation, or you might know that they squashed many innovations that their smart engineers came up with because they worried that it would upend their monopoly. I wonder about what are the innovations that we're not seeing today, and we could see them in 5 years if we pass this legislation. That's incredible.
I want to go to the audience. Ma'am, I know you had a... sure, Baron, you have the mic.
Hi,
Be nice.
So we've been writing about this question of content moderation for months, and it seems like we're doing the same thing today that the members of the committee themselves have been doing, which is we're talking about what people want and what they intend and so on, instead of about the text of the bill. So the text, the operative textual things here are the bill removes the very provisions of antitrust law that cause the courts to dismiss the suits brought by Parler, and it attempts to, on the other hand, to create some requirement that they show material harm to competition. The question is, what does that mean? Nobody seems to know what it means. The concept came from Zoe Lofgren, who introduced what seems like similar legislation, which talked about harm to the competitive process. It's not clear whether those two things are different. The American Bar Association warned that the change could be interpreted by the courts to mean that ICOA is essentially a sort of common carrier regulation, and if that's so, that's exactly what Republicans want in Texas and Florida. On the other hand, we've done a lot of research, and if those two things are the same, and they seem to be the same, the courts talk about them similarly. They talk about harm to competition and harm to the competitive process as interchangeable, and what the scholarship says about this, if you look, for example, at Professor John Newman's paper, is he says that that process is so ill-defined as to be effectively devoid of content, or that it produces results that are so one-sided that the Supreme Court abandoned it after a brief dalliance. And what he's talking about there is what Greg Worden said, veteran of the Federal Trade Commission, that the reason it was one-sided was that, as Greg Worden explained, that focusing on the competitive process rather than on consumer welfare favors the plaintiff. So I'm totally mystified, because what the academic experts seem to be saying here is that focusing on process invites the courts to inject their own values. It actually makes things easier for plaintiffs, not harder, which is what Zoe Lofgren was originally trying to do. She was trying to say, Parler's suits fail today because they can't show conspiracy, they can't show market power, et cetera. They're trying to create some hurdle to clear, but it's not clear that that does it. It seems to do the opposite. Charlotte, what does that language actually mean, and how can we be sure that the courts will interpret it to ensure that Parler can't sue because Parler has been denied carriage on Amazon or Google or Apple?
So I think it's very clear that they're calling past precedent of antitrust law. That's what I read when I read the text, material harm to competition. I also want to think about, you said the ABA said this, it was actually the ABA antitrust section. And when reporters looked into this, what they found was it was actually just a few lawyers of the antitrust section. I go to the antitrust bar spring meeting every year. This was not a representative sample of the entire antitrust bar. There was a lot in your question. I feel like there was one more piece I wanted to respond to.
What precedent is it that is being referred to? Because David Cicilline cites one case, which is 9X versus Discon. And what he seems to be referring to seems to be the language in that case that says you have to show that there's harm to someone more than just one party. And I can understand conceptually how that seems like it would make things harder for Parler. But what that case is actually about, what the harm to the competitive process standard is actually about, is actually, again, it makes things easier for the plaintiff, because what it says is you don't have to show effects at all. You just have to show that the kind of conduct at issue is something that's offensive to the competitive process, that it disrupts that. And what that specific case said was that the specific conduct at issue, while it was fraudulent, was not the kind of harm that Congress was concerned with the antitrust laws. Here, Congress is clearly concerned with something very different, and I don't know what the courts are going to do with that language.
So it's not the harm to competitive process right now, it's material harm to competition.
Right, which again, Discon treats as being interchangeable. So it's hard to tell what the courts are going to do. So what cases are we supposed to look at?
So when we think about harm to competition, I think a lot of times it's contrasted with harm to competitors, and I think that's where this idea comes from, that it has to be not just harm to one company. But I really do think that, and this is what the sponsors say as well, that it is drawing on the history of antitrust law and the precedents of antitrust law, and huge step forward that we're making here is identifying the category of companies to which this should apply, but that for 3A3, it really is drawing on the history and precedents of antitrust law. So it would be limit. So I'm remembering now the piece that I wanted to respond to. You were saying it doesn't require an effects showing, I think it's very clear that it does require an effect showing. I think that's what material harm to competition is requiring. It is going to require an effect showing. It's with 3A3, since we're digging in on the text, it's in the text of the clause. With some of the other more specific clauses, the material harm to competition component is in an affirmative defense. I think that makes a difference. But with 3A3, it's right there in the text of the clause, and so I think it's quite clear that you're going to need an effects determination.
I want to make sure that we get to.
Sorry, I know that was really digging in on the details, but.
All right.
Very quickly.
Yeah, is this on? Okay, cool. All right, hello there. I'm Marina Polachek. My question here is, well, this is I'm reading this as a very busy bill, very messy thing. Yeah, okay, so one of the things that is kind of being highlighted here is how the ICOA and the logistics providers fulfilling orders for Amazon, don't we already have that with the post office doing Amazon Sundays? And sometimes UPS and FedEx do deliver non-prime Amazon packages. Yes, we had the gray and blue vans. They're prime vans, we all know. We have unmarked prime vans too, so they're doing their own thing. But when you subcontract out to other deliveries, I live in more of a residential area of Northeast Pennsylvania, so you're going to have a lot more contractors, subcontractors who can deliver to more of the rural areas that maybe Amazon never heard of in their life. And also, something else that was pointed out, I think Charlotte noted this, the role of Congress is to set values with the ICOA. Are you looking at setting like carrier rates like rail freight carrier rates or tractor trailer carrier rates, box truck? What kind of values are we talking about? Like affording the good without increasing the price of the good for the consumer, or just, well, the corporations always have to win, like, you know, house always wins in gambling?
So with respect to, the good news is the local delivery companies that Amazon's been using, what the bill, let's set the bill aside. Let's talk about what's happening today. Amazon can subcontract with whomever they want. If I am Amazon, when I enter into a contract with you, small delivery person, I will make sure that you get that package there on time, otherwise there's going to be hell to pay. Otherwise I will take all my business and go somewhere else. That's what they do today. That's the way that they're able to use these small delivery services in localities such as yours, where they may not have their own trucks, or they may want to find somebody local to do that. The problem with this legislation is it will actually disallow Amazon from using their own services. It will say the third-party seller can now do their own shipper. They can pick whomever they want. It may get there whenever they want, and it may not be the local delivery system. If I am the third-party seller, I can tell you what I would do most likely, because I know that I'm not going to get raked over the coals if it's there 2 months from now. If I'm the third-party seller, I will send it the cheapest way possible. It's what I do when I sell stuff online. If you, please buy from me online, but if you buy from me online, it's going in a UPS drop box, okay? Or sorry, USPS drop box. That's how I ship. So it might get there in 2 days, might get there in 6 weeks, might never get to you. But it's Amazon's rep that's on the line when the stuff doesn't arrive. That's the difference there. And Baron, real quickly on your point, I think you raised a really good one. The question is ultimately, because everything's left so pie in the sky, you have to look at what would the in-house counsel do? If you are in-house counsel at one of these businesses and the remedy is breakup. So I have a choice between removing Parler or not. And if I risk taking that suit, if maybe all of your arguments are well and good, and I'm the in-house counsel and I risk making a bad decision by kicking off Parler, and it turns out that's a violation of competition law under 2992, then the entire remedies available in 2992 are available if I just happen to get it wrong or if a judge happens to get it wrong. If I happen to get it right, well, congratulations. I get to pay all my defense attorneys a heck of a lot of money, now I'm out my defense fees. So that's the other thing that's missing from this is, and this is a more macro problem for the U.S. writ large, we don't have a loser pays model where there's no disincentive to sue.
There's no private right of action in the bill.
No, but it's going to be, the way it goes is somebody's going to go to the FTC, and the FTC is going to say, I like you business, I don't like you business, I will enforce for you, I will not enforce for you. You worked at the FTC, I worked at the FTC. Let's not sugarcoat it, especially now. It's a very political organization. And that's how it's going to play out. Now, instead, we could do something very simple. We can ask Congress to write the law it wants to see enforced. Write the law it wants to see enforced. Do you want this to be an issue? If yes, continue to leave it in. If you want no, then perhaps considering some of the amendment language that was proposed. If it has nothing to do with content moderation, make it crystal clear this has nothing to do with content moderation by adopting the legislation given to you by the Democratic senators. But you don't want to do that. Why? Because you want Republicans to continue to believe what you think is a myth, that once they pass this law, they can say whatever they want on whatever platform that they want with impunity. And if that's what you really want, if you want to mislead your co-sponsors, you are free to do so. But I would ask you to actually do what is honest and tell them the truth. Every time they say it incorrectly, stand up, stop them, say, Senator Cruz, you're absolutely wrong. Don't worry, this bill will not impact content moderation. That would be the honest thing to do if that's what the bill truly does. If it's not what the bill truly does, then you need to turn to your Democratic Party and say to that.
Let's not question people's honesty here. Charlotte, do you want to address that, and then we're going to wrap up?
Yes, I mean, you're repeating the same argument, so I'm happy to repeat my response. I think that is not what the bill does. I think that's very clear. I think when folks are talking about the impacts of the bill on content moderation, I think they are talking about the benefits that competition can bring to content moderation. So I'm happy to talk about those benefits. I think right now we have a situation where it's very difficult for a user or an advertiser to leave these platforms if they're not happy with how the platform is running. That applies if what is making them unhappy about the platform is their privacy being ignored. It applies if what they're unhappy about the platform is the platform's not doing a good job of content moderation, the features aren't good, all kinds of quality factors that people are not able to make a decision based on today because of the lock-in effects, because competitors are prevented from having a fair shot. If we have competition, people can choose an alternative platform for whatever reason they want. Consumer choice is an important value of antitrust law. I think consumers would like to have a diversity of options for these platforms, and that includes on content moderation.
So just so I understand.
I want to make sure Will gets a chance to jump in here.
Yeah, can I just close out one point? What is the choice that I lack today? Because last time I checked, hashtag delete Facebook was a very real thing. Last time I checked, Rumble is just skyrocketing as a third-party site. We've never had more choice. In fact, Bernie Sanders complains that there are too many choices today. So, I'm just very, very confused about this whole there's no competition, there's no choice argument.
So network effects, I'm happy to explain. The way that I like to do it for a generalist audience is I want to be where the people are. It is not easy to delete Facebook. Facebook is where you can reach your local school, your important institutions that you need to communicate with. It's where I reach members of my family who aren't using, Be Real is like my new social network. Certainly there are alternatives out there, but they are not serving the same purpose as Facebook. I think we saw that in the Cunningham memo, which just became public this week. Facebook doesn't see those companies as competitors. Those are not a real option for consumers.
Will, I'm going to give you the last call. We're a few minutes over.
I think we were, again, sort of, even in responding to Barron's question about the text of the bill, getting pretty far from the text of the bill. I think the relevant concern has to do with what constitutes discrimination between equally situated services and which are equally situated. Here, between something like Twitter or Omegle and Parler, we do see a difference in how they were treated by app stores. And the bill seems pretty clearly written to preclude or prohibit that disparate treatment. I don't see a good way around that language, even if people may, want the greater competition or availability of Parler within the App Store. I think that's a fine case to make for the bill, but you have to actually make it and embrace that would be its effect.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming to this panel. This obviously is a very live debate, and I'm sure all these folks would be happy to talk about it. And if you're interested in learning more, you can always follow some of the IGF resources. Follow me on Twitter. I'm sure all these folks would be happy to get a follow as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.